picture this. India has a brand new constitution, one that guarantees rights for every single citizen. But, less than a year in, it faces its first massive test. That's what we're digging into today, the landmark case of State of Madras versus Champakam Dorairajan. This was really the first big battle pitting an individual's freedom against the state's vision for social good. And believe it or not, it ended up changing the constitution itself.
At the heart of it all is this one simple but incredibly profound question. Can the government deny someone admission to college based on their caste, even if it's for what they call social good? Is a policy like that even constitutional? Well, that was the exact puzzle the Supreme Court had to solve back in 1951.
So, to really get what this whole conflict was about, we have to look at a policy called the Communal Government Order, or just the communal GO for short. And this wasn't some new rule they dreamed up. Nope, this was a leftover, a policy from a totally different era.
I mean, this order was put in place way back in 1927, in the old Madras presidency, long before independence. So when India's new constitution came into force on January 26, 1950, you'd think this policy would just fade away, right? Wrong. The state of Madras kept right on using it for admissions to its medical and engineering colleges.
So how did this thing actually work? Well, it was a pretty rigid system. For every 14 seats available in these colleges, a certain number were set aside for specific communities. You had spots for non-Brahmins, for backward Hindus, for Brahmins, for Harijans, for Anglo-Indians and Christians, and for Muslims. This meant getting in wasn't just about your grades, it was all about this communal quota.
Now, a system like this, a relic from the past, was pretty much guaranteed to clash with the new constitution. And that challenge came from one person who decided to take a stand, Srimati Champakam Dorairajan. See, Champakam Dorairajan had the marks. She was fully qualified, but she was denied a spot. Why? Because she was a Brahmin, and the few seats reserved for her community were already full. The rejection had nothing to do with her abilities. It was based entirely on her caste. So she took them to court. Her argument was simple. The communal GO completely violated her new fundamental rights. She pointed to two key parts of the Constitution. First, Article 15.1, which says the state can't discriminate against anyone based on their religion, race, or caste. And then, even more directly, Article 29.2, which flat out says that no citizen can be denied admission into a state-run school on those exact same grounds. And on July 27, 1950, the Madras High Court agreed with her. They struck down the order, calling it unconstitutional. But the fight was far from over. The state of Madras genuinely believed its policy was necessary, and so they appealed the decision, taking the case all the way to the Supreme Court of India. And just like that, the stage was set for a massive constitutional showdown. This was a head-to-head clash between two really important parts of the Constitution, the fundamental rights of an individual versus the directive principles of state policy. Now, to really get the court's dilemma, you have to understand the difference here. Think of it this way. Fundamental rights, which are in Part 3 of the Constitution, are your personal guarantees. They're legally enforceable. That's the key. They're justiciable, which means you can march into a court and demand they be protected. On the other hand, you've got directive principles in Part 4. These are more like goals or guidelines for the government, things they should strive for, like social welfare. But they're non-justiciable. You can't sue the government for not achieving them. The state of Madras based its entire case on those directive principles. They argued, hey, this communal GO is all about social justice. We're just trying to fulfill our duty under Article 46, which tells us to promote the educational interests of the weaker sections of society. Essentially, they were asking, shouldn't a noble social goal like this be allowed, even if it bumps up against an individual's right? The whole nation was watching. The Supreme Court had to answer this massive question. When an individual's right and the state's goal are in conflict, which part of the Constitution wins? And the verdict came down, and it was absolutely clear. No room for doubt. The Supreme Court backed the High Court. The communal government order was officially declared unconstitutional and completely void. And their reasoning was so powerful. It basically set up a clear pecking order in the Constitution. The court said, look, the directive principles are important, but they have to conform to and run as subsidiary to the fundamental rights. In other words, they can't ever override your fundamental rights. So here's how the court broke it down in 3 simple steps. 1. The GO was a clear violation of Article 29.2. It was discrimination based on caste, plain and simple. 2. The state's argument about Article 46 didn't hold up, because you can't use a non-enforceable guideline to excuse breaking an enforceable right. And 3, this whole thing confirmed that fundamental rights are the top dog. They are paramount. And the constitutional tool they use to do this is Article 13. It basically says that any law that clashes with fundamental rights is, for all intents and purposes, void. Since the communal GO violated the right to non-discrimination, it had to be struck down. End of story. But this wasn't just a win for one person. This was a decision that would ripple through Indian law for decades. It set an absolutely foundational precedent about the very nature of our Constitution. What this case really hammered home was the principle of constitutional supremacy, specifically the supremacy of your fundamental rights. It cemented the idea that an individual's rights are at the very top of the constitutional food chain. Even the best-intentioned government policies can't trample on them.
So the takeaways from this historic judgment are crystal clear. 1. Fundamental rights can be enforced in a court of law, and they are supreme. 2. Directive principles are goals, not laws, and they come second. And 3, and this is the big one, a state's social welfare goals cannot be used as an excuse to violate the fundamental rights of any citizen.
But here's the twist. The story doesn't end there. The reaction to this ruling was so huge, so immediate, that it led directly to the very first amendment to the Indian Constitution, an amendment that was specifically created to allow for reservations. So while the core principle, that rights are supreme, still echoes in our courts, the case itself actually forced a change in the nation's founding document, which leaves us with a really important question today. In this constant tug-of-war between individual liberty and the collective good, how does this 75-year-old ruling still define the limits of state power?